"Just sign the papers, old man," my son Stephen said across my kitchen table, pushing a stack of legal documents toward me with the casual indifference of someone ordering coffee. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." I was sitting in the same chair where my late wife Margaret and I had signed our mortgage papers 35 years earlier, when Stephen decided that his father's signature was just another business transaction to be completed. 20 minutes after what was supposed to be a routine family visit, my own son was calling me old man while demanding I transfer control of everything I'd worked for to his name. "These are just updated estate planning documents, Walter," Stephen's wife Nicole added, sliding her perfectly manicured finger down the signature lines like she was pointing out items on a shopping list. "Modern families handle these things proactively. You don't want to burden us with complicated legal issues when when the time comes." The same kitchen where Margaret had baked birthday cakes for Stephen's first 18 birthdays, where we'd helped him with homework, celebrated his graduation, toasted his wedding, where she'd held his baby daughter before the cancer took her 3 years ago. Stephen wanted me to sign away my independence like I was endorsing a check. "Stop being stubborn about this," Stephen continued, his voice getting sharper, more impatient. "Nicole's been researching elder law. These power of attorney forms protect you from making financial mistakes. The house transfer ensures everything stays in the family without probate complications. Power of attorney, house transfer, like I was already dead and they were just tidying up paperwork. I wonder what you would do if your own son pushed legal papers at you and called you old man in your own kitchen." In that moment, I heard Margaret's voice as clearly as if she were sitting beside me. "Walter, if Stephen ever treats you like you're in his way instead of his father, you make sure he remembers exactly who raised him to be better than that." I understood perfectly what Stephen was really doing. What he didn't know was what I'd been learning about modern estate planning since Nicole first mentioned proactive family financial management 6 months ago, or what I'd been documenting every time they visited with their helpful suggestions about my future. Stephen thought he'd cornered a confused old widower who'd gratefully hand over control of his life to avoid being a burden. He had no idea that his father had spent 40 years in insurance claims investigation, or that the small digital recorder in my shirt pocket had been documenting every word of his helpful suggestions since the day Nicole first walked into my house with her briefcase full of documents. What I'd been recording would soon make my son wish he'd never called me old man. It had really started 6 months earlier, when Stephen began bringing Nicole to our Sunday dinners with what they called important conversations about Dad's future planning. 6 months before the kitchen table confrontation, Stephen had started inviting himself to weekly dinners with Nicole and their daughter Emma, always carrying folders full of what Nicole called educational materials about senior financial security. That first evening, I remember Nicole spreading brochures across Margaret's dining room table while Stephen carved the roast beef Margaret had taught me to cook exactly the way she did. "Walter's been managing his finances independently for decades," Nicole explained to Emma, who was old enough at 16 to understand adult conversations, but young enough to believe everything her stepmother told her. But at 73, he should consider delegating financial responsibility to people who understand modern investment strategies. When she mentioned how much my house had appreciated in value since Margaret and I bought it, I noticed Stephen nodding approvingly. I should have realized then that this wasn't financial advice. This was financial inventory. "Dad, you know I only want what's best for you," Stephen added, though he'd never shown interest in my financial decisions before Nicole entered our family. "Managing property, investments, medical decisions, it's getting complicated for people your age. People your age. Like 73 was a diagnosis requiring immediate treatment. Walter, successful estate planning prevents family conflicts during emotional times," Nicole said, reviewing legal pamphlets like she was reading grocery coupons. "These documents simply clarify who gets to make decisions so Emma doesn't have to worry about complicated inheritance procedures." The way she said, "who gets to make decisions," made it sound like I'd already been declared mentally unfit. I watched Stephen take notes about my supposed mental problems, while Nicole documented my money management issues, creating a case file for why I should hand over control of everything I'd spent 40 years earning. Was this really my family? When did my financial independence become something they needed to manage instead of respect? Later, loading dishes into the dishwasher Margaret had insisted we upgrade in 2019, I realized what was happening. They weren't planning my financial security. They were planning my financial irrelevance. Most people would have confronted them directly, but something in me chose to stay quiet and investigate. I didn't know it yet, but that dinner was the first time they tried to establish grounds for taking control of my life. That day I said nothing about my suspicions, but I'd already started making phone calls they knew nothing about. What Stephen didn't realize was that his father wasn't just Walter, a retired insurance claims investigator who'd spent 40 years processing fraud cases and suspicious financial activities. I'd always been careful about documentation, always kept detailed records, always understood how people manipulated elderly family members for financial gain, because I'd investigated hundreds of cases exactly like this during my career. The conversation that changed everything happened 10 weeks before the kitchen table meeting when I returned from grocery shopping to find Stephen, Nicole, and someone introduced as Kenneth from Heritage Financial Planning, sitting in my living room with evaluation materials spread across Margaret's coffee table. Dad, Kenneth conducts financial competency assessments that help families understand when elderly relatives need professional asset management, Stephen said, avoiding my eyes while this stranger reviewed my personal financial information. We've been concerned about some decisions you've made, and he can provide objective guidance. I recognized the setup immediately. This wasn't financial planning. This was competency evaluation disguised as family assistance. Kenneth stepped forward with assessment materials that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. Mr. Walter, these evaluations measure financial decision-making capacity, investment comprehension, and estate planning understanding. I stayed calm and cooperative, but I noticed several irregularities in their approach. The questions seemed scripted to highlight confusion rather than competence. Kenneth's credentials looked impressive but felt manufactured. Based on preliminary assessment and family observations, we're seeing patterns consistent with financial vulnerability, Kenneth explained to Stephen and Nicole, as if I weren't sitting right there. I'd recommend comprehensive planning assistance to protect assets from poor decision-making. Something about their coordination reminded me of insurance fraud schemes I'd investigated, sophisticated, well-rehearsed, targeting vulnerable elderly people through family pressure. They weren't protecting my financial security. They were manufacturing evidence of my incapacity. That day I pretended to be confused by their questions, but my recorder had captured every word of their scheme. But what I discovered next would change everything. That evening I sat at my desk, the same space where Margaret and I had planned every major financial decision for 35 years, and reviewed documents I'd found hidden in Nicole's purse during their assessment visit. Complete financial portfolio analysis showing my total assets, 840,000 in retirement accounts, 390,000 home equity, 180,000 in savings and investments, power of attorney forms with my name already filled in, waiting only for signatures. Subject demonstrates declining financial judgment requiring immediate family intervention, Kenneth had written in notes I discovered. Asset protection protocols should be implemented before subject makes irreversible financial errors, damaging family inheritance security. Walter's attachment to independent financial management prevents rational estate planning decisions, Nicole had added in her handwriting. Professional intervention required to overcome emotional resistance to appropriate family financial oversight. They'd been researching legal mechanisms that would give Stephen complete authority over my financial decisions while maintaining the appearance of voluntary cooperation. But Stephen had miscalculated something crucial about his target. What he didn't know was that Margaret and I had spent 2 years updating our estate documents after watching her brother lose his savings to similar family manipulation. I pulled out the digital recorder I'd kept hidden in my shirt pocket since Nicole's first visit, the same recording device I'd used during insurance fraud investigations when witnesses wouldn't speak honestly in formal interviews. 6 months of conversations, every dinner discussion about my declining competence, every meeting with financial planners I'd never requested, every calculation of my assets they'd made while pretending to help me. By the time I finished reviewing everything, I realized the truth. Stephen didn't want to protect my inheritance. He wanted to inherit it while I was still alive. Margaret would never forgive this betrayal. What they also didn't know was that I'd already contacted my longtime attorney about suspicious financial planning activities targeting elderly clients. Stephen made his fatal mistake when he assumed I would simply sign documents because he said they were necessary. Instead, I'd spent 10 weeks documenting their manipulation while building my own legal case with evidence they'd never suspected I was collecting. Walter's not going to just surrender financial control because they claim it's protective, I'd told my attorney Margaret had insisted we retain, Charles Morrison. But Stephen doesn't need to know I'm building a financial fraud file. What Stephen didn't know was that I'd spent 40 years investigating insurance scams, which meant I understood elder financial abuse, forged documents, and family manipulation schemes better than he realized. They thought they were dealing with a confused old man. They forgot I'd spent 4 decades identifying fraudulent claims and suspicious financial activities targeting vulnerable people. Charles looked at me across his office and said quietly, "Walter, what they're attempting isn't just inappropriate, it's elder financial abuse disguised as family planning." My son's estate planning had become a systematic attack on my financial autonomy and legal rights. The evidence stacked up quickly. Stephen had collaborated with Nicole and Kenneth to create documentation that contradicted my actual mental capacity, but they'd made procedural errors that any experienced fraud investigator would identify immediately. The competency assessment violates standard evaluation protocols, Charles confirmed. Kenneth's credentials don't match state licensing requirements for financial capacity determination. Stephen had attempted financial manipulation against someone whose career had been devoted to identifying exactly these schemes. Anyone who's ever been underestimated because of their age knows exactly why I kept fighting. I knew Stephen's scheme was finished when Charles contacted the State Financial Crimes Division and Elder Abuse Hotline. The investigation expanded rapidly once we'd reported systematic financial manipulation involving falsified competency evaluations. "Walter, we've identified a comprehensive financial abuse conspiracy," Detective Jennifer explained during our meeting. "Fraudulent capacity assessments, unauthorized financial planning, systematic preparation for asset control through manipulated family pressure." I kept asking myself, when did my son start seeing my savings as his early inheritance instead of my lifetime security? Stephen had collaborated with Nicole and Kenneth to create financial documentation targeting not just my money but my fundamental right to control my own economic decisions. Detective Jennifer said they'd discovered similar schemes involving other elderly parents targeted through family financial planning fraud. I spread evidence across Charles's desk, Nicole's correspondence with estate planning services, Stephen's calculations about my asset timeline, Kenneth's fraudulent competency reports that contradicted my actual mental capacity. "The power of attorney scheme represents systematic financial abuse," Charles noted, "creating false competency concerns while gaining unauthorized access to the elderly victim's complete financial portfolio." Stephen didn't understand that manipulating financial capacity requires legitimate medical authority and ethical oversight, neither of which their conspiracy possessed. What truly sealed his fate was discovering they'd already opened joint bank accounts expecting to gain access to my assets within weeks. They were hunting for my signature, but I was hunting for their prison sentences. That was their first mistake, but not their last. That week, I observed Stephen's confidence crumbling as their financial fraud scheme encountered legitimate oversight. Charles had reported Kenneth's irregular credentials to state licensing authorities. Real financial planning specialists began questioning their assessment methods. "The State Financial Board is demanding a full audit of Kenneth's evaluations," Stephen mentioned during a panicked phone call, his voice tight with anxiety. "They're investigating his credentials and reviewing every competency assessment he's conducted." "What kind of investigation?" I asked, knowing exactly what regulatory scrutiny was dismantling their fraud. "They want to interview all his clients to verify the medical necessity of every financial intervention he's recommended," Nicole added, her professional composure finally cracking. "They're saying some of his documentation might be fraudulent." Emma overheard one of their arguments when they thought I couldn't hear. "Mom, why are the police calling about Grandpa Walter's money?" she asked Nicole during what they thought was a private conversation. "Did someone try to steal from him? The whole financial plan is collapsing," I overheard Nicole telling someone on the phone late one evening. "Walter's independent evaluation came back perfect. The state knows Kenneth was issuing fraudulent assessments. We're looking at criminal charges if they connect us to this scheme." Stephen stopped answering calls from financial planning services demanding explanations for their falsified capacity documentation. Banks called saying the power of attorney paperwork didn't match competency requirements for elderly financial management. Heritage Financial Planning left increasingly desperate voicemails about their fee agreements for services I'd never authorized. And if you think the financial fraud was bad, what happened next would have made anyone question their own family. When licensing investigators began calling to verify my actual financial capacity, Stephen's explanations became desperate. There must be some mistake, he told the investigator. Kenneth assured us the evaluation was comprehensive and legitimate. Nicole started suggesting they might need to take a vacation until this investigation concludes. Stephen began researching whether they could withdraw their financial planning contracts without triggering additional scrutiny. Stephen was learning that financial fraud creates paper trails that experienced investigators follow directly to prosecution. What confirmed their complete panic was when they decided to force my signature by confronting me directly in my kitchen with demands I stop being stubborn about signing their documents. The night before the kitchen confrontation, I sat in my study reviewing the comprehensive evidence file that would expose Stephen's financial abuse scheme and protect my independence permanently. I pulled out Margaret's final letter, written during her last week in hospice care. Walter, everything we built together represents more than money. It represents choices and dignity and the right to control our own lives until the very end. If Stephen ever tries to take those choices away from you, remember that you taught him to respect other people's decisions. Use that knowledge to protect yourself. The evidence revealed calculated manipulation that transcended family financial planning. Stephen had been planning to control my assets while disguising it as elder care, all justified through manufactured competency concerns and fraudulent professional evaluations. Stephen's scheme represents systematic financial abuse involving capacity fraud, Detective Jennifer had explained during our coordination meeting, falsified competency assessments, unauthorized financial planning, conspiracy to gain asset control. Some insurance investigators spend their careers understanding exactly how financial fraud works and how to protect vulnerable people from systematic exploitation. Tomorrow, Stephen would walk into my kitchen thinking he was completing my financial surrender. He didn't know he was walking into a comprehensive elder abuse investigation. What he also didn't know was what I'd been recording in my shirt pocket every time he called me names and demanded my signature. The confrontation came when Stephen, Nicole, and Kenneth gathered in my kitchen, expecting to finalize arrangements for my immediate financial surrender through power of attorney signing. Walter, we've made the difficult decision that's best for everyone's financial security, Nicole began, settling into Margaret's chair with obvious authority. Kenneth has confirmed that professional asset management will protect your inheritance while ensuring your care needs are met. The financial planning documents are straightforward, Stephen added, presenting contracts for services I'd never agreed to consider. Kenneth's evaluation confirmed that independent financial management is no longer appropriate for someone your age. I looked at them calmly from my chair, the same seat where Margaret and I had made every major financial decision of our marriage. Before I sign anything, I said quietly, there's something important you should know about your financial fraud scheme. I reached into my shirt pocket and pulled out the digital recorder Charles had advised me to use, placed it on Margaret's kitchen table between us. Every conversation you've had about my supposed incompetence, I continued, pressing play. Every plan to steal my assets while I'm still alive to watch you do it. Stephen's voice filled the kitchen. Just sign the papers, old man. You're making this harder than it needs to. B. Nicole's voice. Modern families handle these things proactively. You don't want to burden us with complicated legal issues when when the time comes. Kenneth's voice. Subject demonstrates declining financial judgment requiring immediate family intervention. Stephen's face went completely white as he heard his own words played back to him. Dad, what is this? Stephen's voice cracked as he reached for the recorder. When did you start recording us? How could he ask me that? After calling me old man and treating me like a financial obstacle. I've been documenting your scheme since Nicole first mentioned proactive family financial management, I continued. The competency evaluations you fabricated, the power of attorney forms you prepared without my knowledge, the joint bank accounts you opened expecting to access my money. That's impossible, Nicole snapped, her voice sharp with desperation. "Kenneth is a licensed professional. He wouldn't participate in anything fraudulent. And I've been working with law enforcement since you first brought Kenneth into my house to evaluate my mental capacity." Kenneth tried to gather his fraudulent assessment materials, but his hands were shaking too badly to manage the paperwork. Emma stood in the kitchen doorway, finally understanding what her parents had been planning to do to her grandfather. Detective Jennifer was already approaching my front door, her badge visible through the window. "But there's one more recording you should hear," I said, clicking to another file. "It's Nicole last week calculating how much money you'd each get once I was declared incompetent and you gained control of my assets." What finally ended their scheme was the moment they realized their own words had documented their conspiracy to steal from the father and grandfather they claimed to be protecting. Justice came quietly when the district attorney filed comprehensive charges against Stephen, Nicole, and Kenneth 12 weeks after the kitchen table revelation. All three faced multiple felony counts related to elder financial abuse, competency fraud, and conspiracy to commit financial exploitation. The defendants systematically targeted an elderly family member through fabricated capacity assessments and fraudulent financial planning, the prosecutor announced. They face 15 to 20 years in state prison. Kenneth's financial planning credentials were exposed as completely fraudulent. Nicole's estate planning research destroyed their marriage within months. Stephen lost his job when his employer learned about the elder abuse charges and his reputation for manipulating vulnerable family members. 6 months later, Emma knocked on my front door on a quiet Sunday evening. We sat on Margaret's front porch, watching the sunset over the neighborhood where she'd spent her childhood visiting her grandparents. "Grandpa Walter, I'm sorry I didn't understand what Mom and Dad were trying to do to you," she said quietly, her voice thick with shame. "I thought they were trying to help you, not steal from you." "Your grandmother always said that people can surprise you," I told her. "She also said that the people who truly love you want you to stay in control of your own life for as long as possible." I wish Margaret had lived to see Emma choose integrity over inheritance manipulation. Sometimes the quietest justice comes from simply remembering who you are when others choose to forget. Stephen calculated that his elderly father would be easy prey for financial manipulation, disguised as family planning, but he'd forgotten the most important detail about his target. When Stephen told me to just sign the papers, old man, he thought he was commanding a confused elderly victim who'd surrender his life savings to avoid family conflict. He didn't know I understood financial fraud better than he understood estate planning. My recording device wasn't what he expected. My recording device was justice served through proper legal channels, systematic documentation, and complete protection of the financial independence Margaret and I had built together. His scheme lasted 6 months. The criminal charges will follow him for 20 years. And every morning I wake up in the bedroom Margaret and I shared for 35 years, grateful that some families can survive people who mistake aging for opportunity and inheritance for entitlement. He tried to steal my future. Instead, he lost his own. If you're listening to this and someone in your family is trying to manage your money or pressure you into signing documents you don't understand, remember this story. People forget that old men who built their wealth investigating fraud know exactly how to recognize it when their own children try to steal it. And men who've spent 40 years protecting other people's assets know precisely how to protect their own when family becomes the threat. Justice stays quiet until it needs to speak. Then it speaks loud enough for everyone to hear.